a very famous Irish writer. And quite unexpectedly, I had the chance to meet the writer, and he took me to all the places where he had lived and where all the things had happened in his life. So you can't imagine the difference it made. I've done half of the book, and then I threw it and made it again because it's really very, very important to break the atmosphere of the place and such things. So, well, more or less, these are things that I've learned, and if anybody wants to become a literary translator, they should have them in mind. Thank you.
Well, I happen to have read Kathrin Aehnlich's book, and even I'm from New York,
yes,
the metropolitan area originally, and actually I felt that book was a very New York book. Yes. And had a very isolated audience. It's sort of like someone from the Midwest reading the magazine section of the New York Times, yes, on Sunday and thinking, what is this about? So I would think that translating that into an Eastern European language for a people that would be so unfamiliar with the entire culture really is an incredible challenge.
Well, yes and no. First of all, people are not unfamiliar with American culture because, well, people read a lot, and maybe used to read a lot. Now you know how it is. But still, everything that goes in America is interesting, and it used to be interesting, and it's still interesting, and now we have 1 million immigrants here, so every second family has a brother or sister, an uncle, whatever here, so it's not unfamiliar at all. But really, and being a love letter to New York City, the book is something else also. So it's so human. It's so these relations between people helped by their dogs to fall in love with her. So it's quite a human book. But I needed that New York background in order to make it sound authentic.
Do you ever find that there are certain books or pieces of drama that are untranslatable? Like, do you feel that there's something about the culture that is too foreign, or have you ever come across something that you really appreciated in its original language but feel like could never be done justice in another? This is open to everyone.
There are certain things that I've felt are untranslatable within certain works of either drama or fiction. One of the things is what I touched upon when I was talking about the obsession with language. When you're reading it in English, you are not having a relationship to the fact that these people are speaking the dialect that survived in North America, the French, so that's lost in translation. And every so often I just feel like hanging up my skates, right? I had a play this summer that was at the Shaw Festival, just over there at Niagara-on-the-Lake, by Michel Tremblay, who is a playwright whose work has been translated into 36 languages, I think. In fact, in Scotland, we had some Scots translators. One of them lives in Montreal, the other was in Scotland. And their translations of his work were so brilliant because they translated them into Glaswegian working class Scots. And the translations were so brilliant that Michael Billington in the Times, I think in London, said, "This is the best playwright Scotland never had." And I just wanted to cry because I can't do that for a North American theatre company, if I were to translate it into Cockney, for instance, which could be a half-close equivalent, very colourful, very working class, the actors in Philadelphia or in Toronto or Vancouver would have to have an accent coach, and suddenly the people listening to it would think, well, this takes place in East End London. This isn't from a Quebec playwright. So there are certain things like that that are lost in translation, and there are times when I just feel so discouraged about it, I think I have to stop doing this. But then you can allude to the class, you can allude to the, but you don't have the intensity of color and as many signposts about where these characters come from that people I immediately identify with through the language. You know, I've thought I'd love to work on a Black American adaptation with an African American writer, or I'd like to do Hispanic. Some of his plays would lend themselves brilliantly to a Hispanic context because the women characters are very, very strong. But that would be a kind of collaboration adaptation. So my answer is yes, there are certain things that are lost within the work. But I think, as Pravda said, there are other things like speaking about the New Yorkers that are so universal that they're there anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just may want to add that, I mean, there are certain things that almost in principle are untranslatable, which is, I would say that the text is much more than just what it is. It is also how it sits into a landscape, you know, and the context into which it is received, you know, you know, that's beyond the text. I mean, I found in South Africa, for instance, I mean, I can have a novel in Afrikaans, and it seems to mean one thing and say one thing and be one thing, and then that exact same thing in English in South Africa would be different. You know, even if it's a translation that stays as close as is humanly possible to the original, it just becomes different because certain things have been said in that language, you know, in English, or certain things typically get said in English rather than Afrikaans, or, you know, and the debates are also slightly different. So it makes a contribution to a slightly different debate, or a debate at a different point in time. You know, and if you get that within a country, you know, obviously it holds much more for translations that travel across borders.
The impact on the reader or on the theatre goer isn't going to be the same, the relationship, especially in countries where there's a historical or cultural tension that plays as the backdrop.
Could you talk a little more about the difference in the audiences for Afrikaans literature and English language literature in South Africa? What just purely demographically or anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah. I must say, I mean, I think what is true in South Africa is true, what is true of many countries is that it's predominantly women that actually buy books. You know, I mean, and that holds true whether it's in Afrikaans or in English. I would say, I mean, it's difficult to say that. I mean, in Afrikaans there's a big literature for, well, no, I wouldn't say literature, but there's a big big market basically for cooking books and religious books and things like that. So I mean, they're always right up there on the bestseller list. And then the appetite for literature in general isn't very high, except for certain things. I mean, like there was a huge thing with like women's lib and women's sexual liberation, and it's almost like a new frontier that was open. And again, I mean, it's not like recently, but I mean maybe 10 years ago, and then there was a rush of those kinds of novels coming out. Well, what's also I'm not exactly answering the question, but what